G'day, I'm David A. Elliott. Today is the 15th of August 2020 and I'm going to talk about the Covid-19 pandemic. Now, one of the things that does bug me is when we are given figures for different countries, it's raw numbers. So, for example, we could be told there are 5 million cases in America and there's only been about 20,000 in Australia. But the population of Australia is only about 25.5 million, whereas the population of the United States is over 330 million. So it's not exactly a good comparison. I have seen sites that quote you figures on the basis of how many cases and how many deaths there are per million population. But I thought to bring it into a more realistic comparison, I would look at Australia's data and reduce the numbers for a number of different countries as if they had the same population of Australia. And that would give us some comparison between what Australia would be like if we had the same numbers of cases and deaths in proportion as other countries. So the countries I chose as some of the main English-speaking countries. We have heard that the US and UK have had high numbers of cases and deaths, and Australia and New Zealand are supposed to be fairly good countries. New Zealand, they shut down the country very early. Australia was a bit slow, so we did get a bit of a wave, and then things seemed to get better, but perhaps we got too relaxed. And in Victoria, we've had a bigger wave, but that's slowly getting under control. So from the first graph, I've got us comparing the world, which has a population of nearly 7.8 billion, but I've reduced that to the Australian population. So we can see from the worldwide reported figures, they're not too bad. The United States far outranks the other examples I have here, for number of cases at least. You can see that the UK, though, does seem to have more deaths than the United States. I'll talk a bit more on that later. Whereas Australia and New Zealand, you can barely see the deaths on this graph. And cases are still very low in comparison. So I have based this on Australia. The number of cases in Australia, as I've said, about 22,000 or so. If we had the same situation as the rest of the world, it'd be close to 68,000. If we were like the United States, we'd have around getting up towards 400,000 cases, which is about 20 times higher, or getting that way. The UK, not quite as bad. It would mean we'd have up near 120,000 cases. So about 5 or 6 times. If we were New Zealand, we'd be down to about a third of the number of cases that we have recorded so far. So then if we look at deaths, so far we have 361. If Australia was the world, it'd be about 2,500 deaths. So we have been doing well in comparison. If we were the US, we'd be getting up towards 13,000 deaths. The UK, we'd be far worse, getting up towards 18,000 deaths. If we were New Zealand, we'd only be around 115 deaths. So it's about a third the number of deaths. So we are doing very well. G'day, I'm David A. Elliott from the 9th of September 2020. I thought I'd just interrupt myself from the past there because I thought it would be interesting to add Sweden to the data. Now, the reason I think Sweden is a good one to consider is because they went for a herd immunity strategy. This involved basically carrying on as normal and letting the virus take its course, and hopefully that would then end the situation. Now, they did not put in any restrictions at all. They did put in a few, such as things that would protect older people. So I thought to start with, I would look at the number of deaths. So if we go back to the 13th of August again, and once again adjust it to the Australian population level, you will see that the number of deaths is somewhere between those of the US and the UK. So it seems the herd strategy and just letting it run rampant was just as effective as letting it run out of control, as at least on the deaths side of things, as seemed to be happening in the UK and the US. So if you then look at the cases, you can see the cases are a lot lower than the US and higher than the UK. So a bit hard to know what's going on there, but I do think that one thing that needs to be considered with the number of lab-confirmed cases identified, it does depend to some degree on the level of testing that occurs in each of the countries. So we would need to look more in depth into the testing levels and various other things to see why these differences actually do occur. Now next I thought I'd update the data, and the most recent data I have is for the 7th of September. So this is 25 days later. So if you look at the number of deaths 25 days later, you'll see that the US, the UK and Sweden are all at a very similar level. And the US and the UK do seem much closer. So I'll discuss that a bit more in a moment. So if we compare the August 13 number of deaths to the 7th of September number of deaths 25 days later, what initially jumps out is that the UK deaths have actually dropped, which is a bit counterintuitive. So I looked a bit further into this, and it seems around the 13th of August, when I did record those number of deaths, the UK changed the way that they counted the deaths and readjusted their figures to reduce the numbers by 5,000, which was over 10% of the cases that they had. So, in comparing data between countries, you have the added difficulty of each country having a different way of counting the number of cases and the number of deaths. So you can really only generalise with what I am doing at the moment, and to really get a thorough understanding you'd have to go more in depth into the data. But I do see this as just generally showing the trends. So where there's significant differences, you could pretty much say that yes, there has been some effects. So really, in looking at the data, you would say the UK, the US and Sweden are on par with each other pretty much with their number of deaths. There is a bit of a difference in cases, but, well, another interesting fact is that the change in deaths in those 25 days has been very small in Sweden. And also, if we then look at the cases, this is also seems to be the situation there. I do not have an immediate explanation for that. I suppose you could theorise that maybe they've gone through the worst of it and this is where they are, but we will need to wait and see what happens. It's probably something else that needs to be looked at more in depth to see what's going on there and whether they also have changed the way they do it, or perhaps testing is lower at this stage. If you actually look at the Australian number of deaths, they have actually more than doubled in those 25 days. Pretty much most, if not all of these deaths in that time period have occurred in the state of Victoria, where the virus has been very much out of control, and a very high proportion of cases have been in aged care facilities, unfortunately. And this is where most of the deaths are occurring. When I let myself from a few weeks ago talk again, you'll see that I discuss a little bit more of what's happening in Victoria. So I'll put you back to him and I'll return at the end and finish off. Now, you may be interested in the other countries' figures and what their figures would be if they were like, say, Australia or New Zealand. So whilst I talk through the next bit, I will have graphs behind me showing those comparisons. One of the points I'd like to make about why we seem to have low numbers of deaths in comparison to the number of our cases when you look at other countries, like the UK, it's about 15% death rate. Here in Australia, it's about 1.6, 1.7%. In Australia, we have not had the situation arise where our health system couldn't cope with the number of cases. We came close in Victoria recently because the healthcare workers were getting sick, and it hadn't been taken into account that even though we had plenty of resources, the health of the healthcare workers was not thought of as being as severely impacted as it has been. So that is probably an important point, that you have to have your healthcare systems be able to cope. So you have to put in measures to reduce, or what was the expression they used initially? You have to flatten the curve. So yes, you may end up having the same number of cases in the end, but if you spread them out, you have a lot lower number of deaths. So if you're from another country, or you're interested in the data as it relates to another country, put it in the comments below and I will do my best to try and include it in my next video. Okay, here we are back to the future. I'll wind up now and just remind you that if you like my videos, please subscribe and click on the notification bell to be notified when I make more videos. And if you really want to support me, you can go to Patreon and support me there. I mean, no one has yet, so why not be the first? Finally, remember to social distance and wear a mask. I'm David A. Elliott. Try to have a good one and see you around like a rissole.